Hello, my name is Gaini. Welcome to another Booktopia lesson. Voice Kind by Stephen Crane. Stephen Crane was an American novelist, poet, and journalist. He was born into and grew up in a family of 14 children. Despite limited formal education, Crane developed a love of reading and writing at an early age. Crane is best known for his novel The Red Badge of Courage, which was published in 1895. The novel is a classic of American literature and is considered one of the first modern American war novels. Crane's writing career was brief, but a very productive one. He died at the age of 28 due to tuberculosis. Despite his short life, he is regarded as one of the most important writers of his generation, and his works continue to be widely read and studied. Stephen Crane's literary career was brief but influential. He began writing in the early 1890s while still in his early 20s. Throughout his career, his writing was characterized by his vivid and naturalistic style. He focused on themes such as war, poverty, nature, death, spirituality, and human condition. This is a list of his important poems. The poem Voice Kind comes under conflict category in the anthology. It was first published in 1899. Though Crane was born after the end of the American Civil War, his readings and understanding about the Civil War and his experience as a journalist who reported the Spanish-American War influenced him to write this poem. This extract taken from his reports mirrors his negative attitude towards war clearly. The noise, the impenetrable darkness, the knowledge from the sound of the bullets that the enemy was on three sides of the camp, the infrequent bloody stumbling and death of some man with whom, perhaps, one had messed 2 hours previous, the weariness of the body and the more terrible weariness of the mind, at the endlessness of the thing, made it wonderful that at least some of the men did not come out of it with their nerves hopelessly in shreds. Voice Kind by Stephen Crane. Do not weep, maiden, for voice kind, because your lover threw wild hands towards the sky, and the affrighted steed ran on alone. Do not weep, voice kind. Hoarse, booming drums of the regiment, little souls who thirst for fight. These men were born to drill and die. The unexplained glory flies above them. Great is the battle god, great, and his kingdom, a field where 1,000 corpses lie. Do not weep, babe, for voice kind, because your father tumbled in the yellow trenches, raged at his breast, gulped and died. Do not weep, voice kind. Swift, blazing flag of the regiment, eagle with crest of red and gold. These men were born to drill and die. Point for them the virtue of slaughter. Make plain to them the excellence of killing, and a field where 1,000 corpses lie. Mother whose heart hung humble as a button on the bright splendid shroud of your son, do not weep, voice kind. Let's try to understand the meaning of the first stanza. Now, this poem, Voice Kind, appeared in a poetry volume under the title voice kind, and this is the opening poem of the poetry collection. Interestingly, Stephen Crane left this poem untitled. Therefore, sometimes we can see that this poem's title is given as Do Not Weep, Maiden for Voice Kind, but in your anthology, this is titled as Voice Kind. In the very first line, the writer addresses a maiden. Maiden is an unmarried young woman. The writer asks her not to cry, claiming that woe is kind. Definitely, woe is kind is an ironical statement, so irony is there. So the title of the poem is ironical. What are the other words you can use? Paradox and also oxymoron. Why paradox and oxymoron? Woe and kind connote two different meanings, but these two words are combined to give a different meaning here. And he asked not to cry, saying that her lover, your lover, threw wild hands towards the sky. Your lover, a soldier, he died in the battlefield. How did he die? By throwing his hands towards the sky. But we know that maybe the soldier was shot in the chest, he lost his balance, he could not bear the pain, and he threw his hands towards the sky, fell off the horse, and died. Affrighted steed, the frightened horse was frightened and he ran on alone without the soldier. So in the last two lines, once again the writer asks the unmarried woman not to cry, claiming that woe is kind. Let's read the second stanza. In the second stanza, the writer addresses the drums of the regiment. Hoarse booming drums. Hoarse means very rough or harsh. Booming drums suggest the deep sound of the drums. Regiment is a unit of military troops. So here he addresses the drums of the regiment interestingly, and he has personified them by using the term little souls. And these drums thirst for fight, they crave for fight. Now in the ancient battlefields, soldiers carried drums into the battlefield to announce the war and also to boost the morale of the soldiers in the battlefield. Then these men were born to drill and die. So who are these men? It's a reference to the soldiers. These soldiers were born to drill and die. Drill is the military training. They would get a military training and then they would go to the battlefield and die. They were born to sacrifice their lives in the battlefield. The unexplained glory flies above them. What can be this unexplained glory? Nobody can explain the glory that they received after sacrificing their lives in the battlefield. Why? Because they are dead. So unexplained glory flies above them. Great is the battle god. So here the writer uses an allusion here. Battle god can be a reference to the Greek god of battle, Ares. Great is the battle god. Great and his kingdom. So here he has used a metaphor here. This kingdom ironically is the battlefield where 1,000 corpses lie, where the dead bodies of the soldiers lie on the ground. In the third stanza, the writer addresses a baby or a small child whose father was killed in the battlefield. Like he asked from the maiden, he asked from the baby not to cry or not to lament over the loss of his father. Your father tumbled in the yellow trenches. So how did his father died? By tumbling off in the yellow trenches. Now trench is a fortification or it can be a long ditch commonly used in the ancient warfare, even in the modern warfare. And in the Second World War and also in the First World War, trenches were used. And even in the American Civil War, they used trenches. So yellow here indicate the unhealthy condition inside the trenches. This father died by once again falling off of a trench. He raged at his breast. Raging at his breast, maybe he clung at his breast because the pain was unbearable, gulped and died. He took his last breath and died. So these two lines simply portray a very horrible picture of the brutality of war. In the last two lines, once again, the writer asks not to weep, claiming that war is kind. In the fourth stanza, the writer addresses the flag of the regiment and is swiftly moving in the air and blazing. Blazing means shining brightly. A swift blazing flag of the regiment, and in this flag there's a crest of an eagle with the colors of red and gold. Crest is a logo or an emblem. Now we know that young men and women, they are drawn to the ceremonial elegance or splendor of war. The uniform, the drums, the flags. And then once again the writer repeats this line, these men were born to drill and die. These young soldiers, young men, they were born to drill and die. He asked the flag to point for them, to make them understand the virtue of slaughter. Now clearly you can understand this is a paradox. Ironical, and also it can be an oxymoronic phrase. Virtue of slaughter. Now virtue means goodness. Slaughter means to butcher or to kill. So how can killing or butchering people a good activity? So virtue of slaughter is a paradox. Make plain to them and make them understand the excellence of killing. It's quite similar to this one. It's once again a paradox. How can killing be an excellent act? We use excellence, this noun, when we achieve something good. Excellent achievement. But here killing cannot be an excellent achievement. Therefore it's a paradox. Excellence of killing. And a field where 1,000 corpses lie. Even in the third stanza he used this word, field where 1,000 corpses lie. It's a reference to the battlefield. Once again it emphasizes the brutality or horrors of war. In the last stanza, the writer addresses a mother whose son was killed in the battlefield. Her heart is compared to a button in the uniform of the soldier's son, hung humble as a button on the bright splendid shroud of your son. Splendid means very elegant, bright shining. Shroud is usually a piece of cloth we use to cover a dead body, but here it's the uniform, very elegant, shining uniform of the dead soldier son. So her heart was compared to a button in this particular uniform. And ironically, this elegance of the uniform simply covered all the terrible wounds of the dead body of the soldier. And then in the very two last lines, once again he repeats, "Do not weep, voice kind." He asked this mother who was grief stricken by the loss of her son not to cry, claiming that voice kind. I have finished explaining the lines of the poem. Now, this is the paraphrase of the poem. For those who need a thorough understanding about the meaning of the poem, you can pause the video and read the paraphrase. What are the themes discussed in the poem? Since this poem comes under conflict category, and also it's dealt with war, the very first theme should be cruelty and futility of war. And the next one is loss of human lives. In this poem, the writer addresses a maiden whose lover was killed in the battlefield, then a babe whose father was killed in the battlefield, finally a mother whose son was killed in the battlefield. So all these are human lives, valuable human lives. So loss of human lives is discussed in the poem. Indirect victims of war. Now, when it comes to warfare, there are two types of victims: indirect victims and direct victims. Direct victims are the soldiers, and indirect victims can be the loved ones and also the civilians who would get caught in between the fightings of two fractions, and those are the indirect victims. So in this poem, the maiden, the babe, and the mother can be taken as actually symbols for indirect victims of war. The other theme is youth and adventure. Now we know young men and women are drawn towards adventure, glory, heroism. So that's why young men love to enlist in the army and to fight for their country. That's why they love to sacrifice their lives. It's because of the nature of youth. And the other theme is people who create war use the young people as cannon fodder. Now, cannon fodder means soldiers regarded merely as material to be used in war. So these young men were used in the battlefield for their own advantage and their purposes, and simply they had to sacrifice their lives in order for the others to get their advantages. The other theme is ceremonial elegance of war. Young men are attracted to this. The drums, the flags, the uniform, all these are the pomps of war, and young men are drawn towards this elegance. That's why they love to enlist in the army. Most of the young men love to enlist in the army because they are drawn towards the elegance or the splendor of war. The last one, and this is one of the most important themes in the poem, using an ironical title or paradoxical title, War is Kind, the writer Stephen Crane tries to negate the idea of glorification of war. Stephen Crane was against the idea of romanticizing war. So this poem is a very good example to show his standpoint about glorification of war. What are the literary devices used by Stephen Crane in this poem? The very first one is paradox. The title is a paradoxical one. Another term you can use here is oxymoronic title. What are the other examples for paradoxes? Virtue of slaughter and excellence of killing. These two terms are also paradoxical. Another technique used by the writer is apostrophe. Apostrophe is where the writer addresses someone or something who is not literally present. Throughout the poem, the writer addresses a maiden, a babe, a mother, and not only that, in the second and the fourth stanza, he addresses drums and the flag of the regiment as well. So, these are the examples for apostrophe. Then verbal irony. This is quite similar to the very first technique, paradox. Throughout the poem, the writer has used irony, beginning from the title to the last line of the poem. The writer sounds sarcastic and ironical. What are the examples? The title voice kind, virtue of slaughter, excellence of killing, bright, splendid shroud, and even great is the battle god, great and his kingdom. All these lines are ironical and example for verbal irony. Then what about dramatic irony? Dramatic irony is where the reader or the audience knows something where the character or characters of a particular poem or a story or a drama does not know about. Now, here the writer repeatedly asks these victims not to cry, claiming woe is kind, but as the readers, we know very well that woe can never be kind. So, therefore, we can say the writer has employed dramatic irony as well. Personification is another technique employed by the writer. The writer addresses the drums in the second stanza, and they are personified by the term little souls. Even in the fourth stanza, he addresses the flag of the regiment. He seems to treat the flag as someone who is capable of making the soldiers understand the virtues of slaughter and excellence of killing. So, two examples of personification. He personifies the drums and the flag of the regiment. Then another powerful technique is repetition. The writer has used repetition to emphasize or highlight his standpoint or his attitude towards war. What are the examples? Throughout the poem, you can see, do not weep, woe is kind. This is repeated. If some lines continuously repeat in a poem, we can call it as a refrain as well. So these two lines, do not weep, woe is kind, is a nice example for refrain. What are the other examples for repetition? This line, these men were born to drill and die. It's repeated even in fourth stanza as well. Then simile is another technique used by the writer. In the very last stanza, the writer says, mother whose heart hung humble as a button. Mother's heart is compared to a button in the splendid shroud of her son. Another technique used by the writer is allusion. In the second stanza, the writer says, great is the battle god, great and his kingdom. Here, this battle god can be an allusion to the Greek war god Ares. Then let's take all these sound devices: alliteration, assonance, and consonance. Now, what are the alliteration examples for alliteration used in the poem? In the very first line, do not weep, voice kind. W sound is repeated. Weep, wo. And then first for fight. F sound is repeated here. Then drill and die. D is repeated here. What about this line? Great is the battle, God great and his kingdom. G sound is repeated. Then tumbled trenches. T sound is repeated. And in the very last stanza, heart hung humble as a button. H sound is repeated. So there are lots of examples for alliteration in the poem. Then examples for assonance: affrighted steed. E sound is repeated. Affrighted steed. Wild sky. E sound is repeated once again. And in the last stanza, hung humble. A sound is repeated. So these are some examples for assonance. Then what about consonants? Swift blazing flags. Swift blazing flags here. S sound is repeated. Then wild hands towards. What's the repeated sound? D sound. Wild hands toward the sky. Then unexplained glory flies above them. L sound is repeated. Unexplained glory flies above them. So these are some examples for the sound devices used in the poem. Then what about rhyming words? We cannot identify a regular rhyme scheme in this poem because this can be taken as an unrhymed free verse. Yet there are some words where they rhyme at the end of the lines of the poem. For example, regiment and fight, and then die and lie, and also kind and died. Then what about visual imagery? The writer creates a very disturbing picture of the battlefield where there's violence, bloodshed, and even loss of life. So visual imagery is a very powerful technique used in the poem. Auditory imagery. Now here, hoarse booming drums of the regiment. The word booming imitates the deep sound of the drums of the regiment. So it's a nice example for auditory imagery because booming is an onomatopoeic word. What about the symbols employed by the writer? Drums in the second stanza can be taken as a symbol. We know that drums are still used in military parades and ceremonies. So drums can be taken as a symbol for war and also the enthusiasm of the soldiers to fight. Then another symbol is flag, swift blazing flag of the regiment. Flag symbolizes military pride and patriotism. Then in the very last stanza, the word shroud. Now we know shroud is a burial garment. In this case, the soldier's uniform. This symbolizes death as well as concealment of the brutal reality of the soldier's death. The very last technique I am going to discuss is sarcastic tone. Now remember, Stephen Crane is a war poet. His standpoint towards war is very clear throughout the poem. He negates the idea of glorification of war throughout the poem. Therefore, he has employed this sarcastic, ironical tone from the very beginning of the poem till the very last stanza of the poem. Now, these are the techniques. There are lots of techniques employed by the writer. I hope you got a thorough understanding about both themes and the techniques of the poem. And that brings us to the end of today's session on Booktopia lessons. I hope you found it informative and educational. Thank you so much for tuning in. See you in the next lesson.